Harlem in 1951 was a place of fragile dignity, a city within a city where we built our own cathedrals of commerce and respect because the world downtown refused to give us a seat at their table. The air that afternoon was thick with the scent of roasting coffee and the exhaust of the crosstown bus, a Tuesday that felt like any other until the world tilted on its axis. My mother, a woman whose grace was the quiet engine of my life, had gone to the corner market on 132nd Street, the same walk she'd taken for a decade. She was a woman who lived by the math of kindness, a woman who had never raised her voice because her presence was enough to command a room. But the official law, the one that lives in the leather-bound books and the marble precincts, doesn't recognize that kind of royalty. To the system, she was just another face in a neighborhood they wanted to contain, a demographic they viewed through the lens of suspicion and neglect. I was sitting in my office above Small's Paradise, a glass of Hennessy on the desk and a stack of ledgers in front of me, when the news hit like a physical blow. A man, an outsider with the smell of cheap tobacco and the rot of a hidden hood in his pocket, had decided to make a statement. He hadn't just insulted her. He had reached out and grabbed her arm, a violation of the only sacred thing I had left in a life built on shifting shadows. He was a KKK agitator, a man who thought that by coming into Harlem and touching the mother of the king, he could prove that his hatred was more powerful than my authority. The law would have called it a minor scuffle, a simple misunderstanding between a citizen and a visitor. They would have filed a report, perhaps, and then let the man walk back to the safety of his own neighborhood, secure in the knowledge that his skin was a permanent get-out-of-jail-free card. But my mother is not a citizen of their world. She is the soul of mine. When I heard he had laid hands on her, I didn't feel the heat of anger. I felt the absolute bone-deep cold of a final verdict. I felt the weight of my coat as I stood up, the silence in the room becoming a vacuum as my men, Illinois Gordon and Willie Lee, saw the shift in my eyes. They didn't have to ask what was happening. They could feel the air turning to lead. I thought about the way her hand used to feel on my forehead when I was a boy, a hand that had worked 1,000 hours to ensure I never had to feel the bite of the system's whip. And now, a man whose heart was filled with the filth of the clan had thought he could bruise that skin and walk away. He didn't understand the geography of Harlem. He didn't realize that in this neighborhood, the sidewalk beneath his feet belonged to the woman he had just insulted. The law downtown thrives on delays and technicalities, but out here, the response is as certain as the sunrise. I walked out of that office and into the afternoon light, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see the business of the streets. I only saw the line that had been crossed. The man was still there, emboldened by the silence of the crowd, thinking his bravado was a shield. He didn't see me coming because a man like that never sees the truth until it's standing directly in front of him. He saw a man in a grey suit, a man with a fedora and a quiet stride, and he thought he was looking at someone who would listen to reason. He didn't realize he was looking at the end of his own timeline. I stood there, watching the way he gripped the fabric of her coat, the way his knuckles were white with a coward's strength. I didn't reach for my piece. I didn't raise my voice, and I just looked at him. And in that look, I saw the realization begin to dawn on him. The slow, terrifying understanding that he hadn't just grabbed an elderly woman. He had grabbed the third rail of Harlem. The official law would never understand the sanctity of this moment, the way the community held its breath as the king defended the queen. But as I took the first step toward him, I knew that the lesson I was about to teach him would be one that 190 people would never forget. The debt wasn't just for the insult. It was for the audacity of thinking that in my city, my mother could ever walk in fear. The 700 words of this beginning are just the preamble to the silence that was about to fall over the block. a silence so deep you could hear the heartbeat of the man who was about to realize that his life was no longer his own. By the time I reached the corner, the NYPD patrol car had already pulled up, the siren giving one final lazy yelp before the engine cut out. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms pressed and their faces set in that mask of bored indifference they saved for anything that happened north of 110th Street. They walked towards the commotion with a slow, heavy-footed stride, the sound of their nightsticks slapping against their thighs a rhythmic reminder of who the system thought held the power. I stood back, a shadow among shadows, watching the theatre of the official law begin its predictable performance. My mother was standing there, her chin held high, the mark of the man's grip still visible on the fine wool of her sleeve. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a witness to a tragedy of manners. The agitator, the man with the clan rot in his soul, was already talking, his voice loud and frantic, weaving a story of a misunderstanding, an accidental contact. He looked at the white officers with a desperate, knowing intimacy, an unspoken plea for the solidarity of the skin. The law, in its infinite and cold wisdom, began to take notes. I watched the lead officer, a man named Miller, who had taken my money more than once, to look the other way, listen to the man's lies with a nodding sympathy. He didn't look at the bruise forming on an elderly woman's dignity. He looked at the agitator's ID and the way the man stood. When it was my mother's turn to speak, Miller barely looked up from his notepad. His questions were short, clipped, and laced with a subtle interrogation that made it feel like she was the one on trial for being in the way of a white man's hand. The law downtown thrives on these small erasures. They don't need to burn a cross to tell you that you don't matter. They just need to call an assault a scuffle and a violation a dispute. They use the language of the bureaucracy to bury the truth of the street. I could see the outcome before Miller even closed his book. "Look, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending patience that made my blood turn to ice. "It's a crowded sidewalk. People bump into each other. There's no permanent damage here. Why don't you just go on home and let us handle the report?" The shrug of his shoulders was the final verdict of the precinct. It was a clear message. The system doesn't have time for the pain of Harlem unless there is a body to count. They viewed the assault on my mother as a nuisance, a minor friction in the gears of the city. They were blind to the fact that they weren't just dismissing a crime. They were dismissing the only thing that keeps a community from sliding into chaos, the certainty of protection. I felt the weight of my own authority pressing against my ribs, a stark contrast to the hollow theatre of the two men in blue. The law is a shield that only protects the people who look like the men holding it. For everyone else, it's just a set of rules that tells you to stay in your place. Miller looked at me then, recognizing me in the crowd, and for a second I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He knew he was failing a test he didn't even realize he was taking. He thought he was being practical by letting the agitator walk. He didn't realize he was being a coward. He told the man to move along and keep out of trouble, watching as the agitator smirked and adjusted his jacket, his chest swelling with the victory of a man who had just been told he was untouchable. The officers got back into their car and drove away, leaving the sidewalk to the silence of the afternoon. But the air didn't go back to normal. It stayed heavy, charged with the electricity of a response that was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. The precinct had closed its eyes, which meant I had to open mine. The official law had signed off, filing their indifference into a cabinet where it would never be seen again. They had left the street to me, exactly where I've always lived. I walked over to my mother, took her arm with a gentleness that Miller could never understand, and led her away. But my mind was already 3 blocks ahead. The law had shrugged, but Harlem doesn't forget. and I was about to make sure the man who thought he was moving along was actually walking straight into a surgical reckoning that no report could ever document. When the patrol car rounded the corner and the taillights faded into the Harlem haze, the street didn't return to its normal rhythm. It stayed suspended in a cold, electric anticipation. The agitator thought he had won because the men with badges had patted him on the back and sent him on his way, but he failed to realize that in this neighborhood, the police are just a temporary audience. The real power lives in the eyes that never blink. I didn't need to chase him. I didn't need to make a scene on a public sidewalk while my mother was still catching her breath. I simply activated the network. My organization isn't built on soldiers alone. It's built on the invisibles, the people the world downtown ignores, but who see every moving part of this city's soul. I walked my mother home, her hand steady on my arm, but my mind was already reaching out across the blocks. By the time I reached for the telephone in my study, the fingerprints were already being gathered. I started with the shoeshine boys on 125th Street, the ones who see the world through the dirt on a man's boots. Within 20 minutes, I knew the brand of the agitator's tobacco and the specific, arrogant tilt of his gait. Next, I checked in with the cab drivers who wait outside the transit hubs. They told me where a man with that specific look, that smell of cheap whiskey and unearned confidence, had been dropped off earlier that morning. Then came the bartenders, the keepers of the city's loudest secrets. I called Joey O'Brien, a man who knows that a debt to Bumpy Johnson is a debt that never expires. Seat 95, 96. He didn't need a name. He just needed a description. Tall, eyes like a cornered rat, wearing a jacket that's seen better days and carrying a sense of entitlement he didn't work for, I told him. Joey's response was immediate. Sight start, the man had been in his place, Ali's Tavern, bragging about a mission to remind the people of Harlem who really owned the streets. Seat 97, 98. The law downtown operates on warrants and red tape, on a system of identification that requires a photograph and a signature. But out here, a man's identity is written in the shadows he leaves behind. I gathered the intel like a weaver pulling threads into a shroud. Site start. I found out where he worked, a small, grease-stained auto shop in the Bronx, where men like him gathered to talk about the good old days that never existed. I found out the name of the hotel where he was staying, a place that specialized in the kind of anonymity that cowards crave when they're away from their own porches. By 6 p.m., I had a complete file on a man who, 4 hours earlier, had been a nameless ghost. I knew his family in Virginia, the debts he owed to bookies in Brooklyn, and the exact time he planned to have his dinner. The official law would call this an invasion of privacy, but in Harlem we call it preparation. You don't go to war with a ghost. You make him flesh and blood so you can hold him accountable for the weight he puts on the world. I sat in my chair, the darkness of the office matching the focus in my mind, and I looked at the slip of paper where his name was finally written in ink. Arthur Vance. He thought he had disappeared into the anonymity of the city, shielded by the indifference of Miller and his partner. He didn't realize that every step he took was being mapped by a community that protects its own. He had touched the one thing that was off limits, and now the city itself was closing in on him. I didn't need a precinct to tell me who he was. I had the eyes of Harlem, and they were all focused on him. Seat Stardeye signaled for Illinois Gordon and the others, the men who had been with me through every war and every prison stint, CA 104, 105. I handed them the information, the blueprint of a man who was about to learn that in my neighborhood, respect isn't a suggestion. It's the law. The fingerprints were traced, the target was locked, and the surgical retribution was no longer a question of if, but exactly how it would be delivered. Arthur Vance thought the game was over when he left that sidewalk, But he didn't realize that in my world, I don't just retaliate, I choreograph the consequence. I could have sent a team to his hotel to end him in the silence of a hallway, but that would have been too easy. When you violate the mother of Harlem, the response must be a spectacle, not of violence, but of absolute, crushing authority. I decided to host a gala at Small's Paradise, a high society event for 190 of the most influential people in the neighborhood. This was the chessboard, a room filled with politicians, doctors, and the very elite that Vance and his KKK brothers hated most. I sent the invitation through one of my street associates, a man Vance recognized from the auto shop. He was told there was a high-stakes backroom game, an opportunity for a man of his talents to walk away with more money than he'd see in a lifetime of fixing engines. A man like Vance is driven by two things: greed, and the belief that he is smarter than the people he oppresses. He couldn't resist the bait. He thought he was walking into a secret den of vice where he could play the superior outsider. The official law, the men like Miller at the precinct, would never understand this level of tactical psychological warfare. Seat 25-26-277. They operate on the blunt force of an arrest, a physical containment that eventually ends. But I was preparing an emotional containment that would last until the day he died. I spent the afternoon ensuring every detail of the room was perfect: the placement of the jazz quartet, the lighting that pooled on the center of the dance floor, and the seating of the 190 guests. These weren't just witnesses. They were the jury he never thought he'd face. Cité start. I wanted him to see the success, the dignity, and the power of the people he viewed as other. I wanted him to walk into a room where he was the only one who didn't belong, the only ghost at a banquet of kings. The system downtown fails because it tries to punish the man without breaking the philosophy. I was going to do both. I instructed my staff to treat him with an unnerving, silent respect the moment he arrived. He was ushered through the back entrance, his worn jacket a stain against the tuxedos and silk gowns, but nobody commented. They just bowed their heads and led him toward the center of the ballroom. I watched from the shadows of the balcony as he entered, his eyes darting around with a mixture of predatory instinct and growing unease. He looked at the 190 faces, some of the sharpest legal and business minds in the country, and for the first time I saw the arrogance in his shoulders begin to sag. He realized he wasn't in a back room, he was on a stage. The law is a set of rules that can be broken, but a social verdict is a wall that cannot be climbed. I adjusted my cufflinks, feeling the cold precision of the plan as it reached its boiling point. He had grabbed my mother on a public street because he thought he was invisible to the world. Now, I was making him the center of it. The jazz band was playing a low, steady rhythm, a heartbeat for the room that matched the ticking of the clock in my head. We were minutes away from the freeze, the moment where the air would vanish and Vance would realize that in Harlem, the king doesn't need a badge to deliver a sentence. He stood there, a small man in a large room, clutching his invitation like a shield that was already beginning to melt. I took a slow sip of my cognac, savoring the silence I was about to command. The invitation was accepted, the guests were seated, and the king was ready to step into the light. The jazz quartet was in the middle of a smooth, rhythmic transition when I stepped up onto the balcony's edge, my silhouette cutting through the amber glow of the chandeliers. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I simply raised my right hand, palm open, and as if a single wire connected the souls of every person in that ballroom, the music died mid-note. The laughter, the clinking of crystal, the soft rustle of silk, it all vanished in a heartbeat. This is the freeze, a level of psychological dominance that the official law could never hope to achieve. In a courtroom, a judge has to bang a gavel and threaten contempt to get a moment of quiet. But in Harlem, my presence alone is the gavel. I looked down at Arthur Vance, standing in the exact center of the dance floor. and I watched as the reality of his situation finally settled into his bones. 190 people, the doctors who healed our children, the lawyers who fought the system, the men who built empires from nothing, stood perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the man who had dared to touch the woman who birthed the neighborhood. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed the oxygen out of the room. Vance looked around, his head jerking from side to side like a trapped animal, but everywhere he turned he met a wall of dignified, unyielding stares. He was a ghost in a room full of kings, a man who had built his entire identity on the belief that he was the only one who mattered, now realizing that he was completely, utterly irrelevant. I let the silence stretch for a full minute, then 2, then 3. I wanted him to hear his own blood rushing in his ears. I wanted him to feel the eyes of 190 witnesses recording his cowardice for history. The law downtown thrives on the scuffle and the minor dispute, but out here, we call it a reckoning. Vance's hands were shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets, but there was no place to hide. He was under the God's eye now, exposed in the center of a chessboard he didn't understand. I started my descent down the grand staircase, my shoes clicking against the marble with a slow, rhythmic precision that matched the ticking of a clock. Every step I took was a year of the respect he had tried to steal. The contrast was a beautiful, terrible thing. The man who thought he was untouchable was now the only thing in the room that felt fragile. I reached the bottom step and walked into the center of the circle, the crowd parting for me with a silent, synchronized grace. I stopped exactly 3 feet from him. I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't need one. My authority was the only weapon in the room. I looked at the bruise on his soul, the one he had tried to put on my mother, and I let him see the absolute certainty of his own defeat. The official law had looked away, but these 190 people were looking right at him, and their silence was a more final verdict than any judge could ever deliver. I leaned in, my voice a whisper that carried to the very back of the hall, and I told him the only thing he needed to know. I told him that the air he was breathing was a gift from me, and that gifts could be taken back. For 7 minutes the world stopped moving. For 7 minutes Arthur Vance learned that in Harlem the king doesn't just rule the streets, he rules the very air you breathe. The freeze was complete, and the surgical retribution was about to begin. Arthur Vance was no longer the man who had stood on that sidewalk with a chest full of borrowed courage. He was a hollow shell, leaking fear in the middle of a room that had become his cage. The official law, the system that Miller represented, would have expected a spray of bullets or a back-alley beating, a predictable cycle of violence they could understand and file away. But I don't believe in making martyrs out of cowards, and I don't believe in giving the precinct a reason to knock on my door. I believe in a surgical retribution, a strike that leaves the body intact but ensures the spirit is permanently broken. I stood so close to him that I could smell the stale sweat of his panic, the scent of a man who realized that his mission to Harlem had become a life sentence of regret. I didn't raise my hand to strike him. Instead, I reached out and slowly, deliberately adjusted his frayed collar, a gesture of such intimate dominance that it made his knees buckle. The 190 witnesses didn't move. They watched with a cold, analytical detachment as I began to dismantle him with the truth. I told him I knew about the auto shop in the Bronx, the hotel room where his bags were already being moved by my men, and the family in Virginia who believed he was a man of honor. I showed him the photographs Illinois Gordon had taken, not of his crime, but of his life, his routine, and his every vulnerability. I told him that from this moment forward, he would never be alone in the dark again. Every time a car slowed down near his porch, it would be me. Every time a phone rang, and there was only silence on the other end, it would be me. Every time he closed his eyes, he would see the 190 faces in this room, judging him for the cowardice he had shown. The system downtown fails because it thinks a prison cell is the ultimate deterrent, but a prison cell has 4 walls and a date of release. I was giving him a prison without bars, a psychological containment that would follow him across state lines. I took the invitation from his shaking hand and tore it into small, precise pieces, letting them fall like snow onto his boots. "You touched the Queen," I whispered, my voice cutting through the stillness like a razor. "And for that, you are now a ghost." I didn't have him killed. I had him escorted to the edge of the city and told that if he ever looked toward 110th Street again, the freeze would become permanent. This is the difference between street justice and the failed law. The law tries to fix the symptom, but I remove the cause. Sight start var. Vance left that room a broken man, his bravado replaced by a permanent, shaking paranoia that would ensure he never raised his hand to anyone again. Cite 154. 156. He had come to Harlem to remind us of our place, but he was the one who walked away knowing exactly where he stood, beneath the feet of a community that doesn't need a badge to enforce its dignity. The 190 people in that room remained frozen until the doors closed behind him, a synchronized display of power that sent a message far beyond that ballroom. The retribution was surgical, the debt was paid, and the king had ensured that the air in Harlem remained sacred. I picked up my glass of cognac, the amber liquid steady in my hand, and signaled for the band to play. The silence was over, but the lesson was just beginning. I stood by the window of my office as the sun began to set over Harlem, the city turning a deep, bruised purple that matched the color of the memories I kept locked away. It had been 17 years since that night at the gala. 17 years since Arthur Vance learned that the air in this neighborhood has a price, and yet the weight of that sacred line remains as heavy as the day it was crossed. The official law, the one that lives in the marble halls downtown, would tell you that the 1950s were a decade of shifting social contracts and the slow grind of civil rights legislation. They would say that the decrease in public agitators was a result of a changing national conscience and the steady work of the FBI. But the people who live on 132nd Street know the truth is much simpler and much more final. They know that a predator only stops when he realizes that the prey has teeth. The reason my mother never again had to worry about a stranger's hand on her arm wasn't because the world suddenly became a kinder place or because the precinct started patrolling with a new sense of duty. It was because I had drawn a line in the concrete that nobody was willing to step over. I looked down at the streets where the next generation was already beginning to find its feet, and I understood that the freeze wasn't just for one man. It was a testament for the entire city. The law is a set of rules that can be bent by the powerful and ignored by the indifferent, but a sacred line is a boundary that is enforced by the soul of a community. When the system fails a mother, when it calls a violation a scuffle and looks the other way, it abdicates its right to rule. I didn't choose to be the judge of Arthur Vance. I was forced into the role by a precinct that decided my family wasn't worth the ink in their pens. People often ask me about the morality of that night, about the way I used 190 of Harlem's finest to break a man's mind without ever touching his skin. I tell them that I regret the world made such a display necessary. I regret that a man like Vance believed he could bring the terror of the South into my home and find a willing ally in the local police. But I do not regret the result. There is a specific kind of safety that only comes from the certainty of a response. It is the peace of knowing that if you touch the heart of Harlem, the city will stop beating until the debt is settled. I've watched the years pull at the fabric of this neighborhood, but the respect we built remains the only currency that hasn't devalued. We became our own protectors because we learned the hard way that the law is a ghost that vanishes when the sun goes down. I took a final sip of my cognac, the glass catching the light of the street lamps below, and I thought about the 190 people who stood still that night. They weren't just watching a king. They were affirming their own right to exist in dignity. They were the wall that Vance couldn't climb, the jury that the system wouldn't provide. My mother lived out her days with her head held high, never again looking over her shoulder, because she knew her son had made the darkness a safe place for her to walk. The sacred line was drawn in silence, but its message was heard in every corner of the 5 boroughs. Harlem protects its own, not with the hollow promises of a precinct, but with the surgical finality of a family that never forgets. I sat back in the shadows, the silence of the office finally feeling like a shield instead of a vacuum. The debt was paid, the line was held, and the king was at rest.